How can someone be completely comfortable with physical connection but panic at the thought of emotional vulnerability? There's a paradox that confuses everyone who's been involved with an avoidant. They can pull you into bed with raw intensity, completely present in your body, touching you like they're memorizing every inch of your skin. They'll make you feel desired in ways that leave you breathless. But ask them how they're feeling afterward. Try to connect beyond the physical, and suddenly you're talking to a wall. They can give you their body completely but won't share what's happening in their mind. They'll be vulnerable enough to let you see them naked but won't let you see their emotions. This isn't hypocrisy or mixed signals, it's how their nervous system has learned to navigate human connection. Understanding this difference will completely change how you see every confusing thing they've ever done. It explains why they can be so intensely present with you physically, but act like complete strangers when you try to connect emotionally. Once you see this pattern, everything else starts making sense. Have you noticed this difference between physical and emotional intimacy in your relationships with an avoidant? If you've been in this situation, share in the comments what that experience was like for you. The distinction between how avoidants handle sex versus intimacy reveals the core of their psychological wiring. For most people, physical and emotional intimacy are connected experiences that build on each other. For avoidants, they're completely separate systems that serve different functions and trigger different responses. When you understand what's happening in each scenario, you'll finally make sense of behaviors that seem contradictory on the surface but follow perfect internal logic once you see the pattern. Let's start with something most people don't realize about avoidant psychology. Sex and intimacy activate completely different parts of their emotional system. Sex feels safe because it has clear boundaries, defined beginning and end points, and doesn't require ongoing emotional vulnerability. Intimacy feels dangerous because it's open-ended, unpredictable, and demands sustained emotional exposure. Think about the difference between performing in a play versus having an unscripted conversation with a stranger. Both involve interaction with another person, but one has clear roles, defined duration, and predictable outcomes. The other requires spontaneous authenticity with unknown consequences. For avoidance, sex is like the scripted performance. There are familiar roles, understood expectations, and natural conclusion points. Physical pleasure creates its own momentum and resolution. Emotional intimacy is like the unscripted conversation. It requires ongoing authenticity, has no clear endpoint, and could lead anywhere. This difference in structure explains why avoidants can be incredibly present during physical connection, but emotionally unavailable during regular relationship moments. It's not that they're using you or being manipulative. They're operating within the boundaries where their nervous system feels safe. Sex provides temporary permission to be vulnerable without the long-term commitment that emotional intimacy implies. When physical connection ends, the vulnerability ends with it. When emotional intimacy begins, there's no natural stopping point, which triggers their fear of being trapped in emotional exposure. Most people interpret this as avoidance being shallow or only interested in physical connection. But that's not accurate. Avoidants can experience profound connection during physical intimacy. They just can't sustain that same level of openness in emotional contexts. It's similar to how some people can be completely comfortable swimming in a pool, but terrified of swimming in the ocean. The physical act is the same, but the psychological context changes everything about how safe the experience feels. Now let's talk about what actually happens in an avoidant's mind during physical versus emotional connection, because the internal experience is completely different in each scenario. During sex, avoidants often report feeling more present and connected than at any other time in their relationships. The physical intensity creates a natural focus that quiets their usually active internal monitoring system. They're not thinking about escape routes, future implications, or emotional demands. They're simply experiencing the moment. Physical pleasure creates what researchers call a flow state, where self-consciousness temporarily disappears and the person becomes fully absorbed in the immediate experience. For avoidance, this might be the only time they can turn off their emotional surveillance system and just be present without fear. The temporary nature of sexual connection also makes it feel emotionally safe. There's an understood beginning, middle, and end to the experience. The vulnerability has natural boundaries that don't extend indefinitely into their daily life. Compare this to their internal experience during emotional intimacy. When someone tries to have a deep conversation or create emotional connection, avoidants report feeling exposed, trapped, and monitored. Their internal alarm system activates because emotional intimacy has no natural endpoint and could potentially change everything about the relationship dynamic. Emotional conversations feel dangerous because they might reveal incompatibilities, create expectations, or establish new emotional obligations. Physical intimacy feels safe because it doesn't typically change the fundamental structure of the relationship. It just provides temporary connection within existing boundaries. This is why many avoidants can have incredible sexual chemistry with someone, but struggle with basic emotional check-ins. The chemistry happens in a contained space. The check-ins happen in unlimited emotional territory. There's another layer to this that most people miss. Avoidants often use sexual connection as their primary way of creating and maintaining emotional bonds, which creates confusion for partners who need verbal and emotional intimacy to feel connected. For avoidants, sex becomes their emotional language. It's how they show care, create closeness, and demonstrate their feelings without having to verbalize emotions or make themselves vulnerable through words. The physical connection carries all the emotional weight that other people express through conversation and verbal affirmation. This creates a fundamental mismatch in many relationships. The avoidant feels like they're being deeply intimate and showing their love through physical connection, while their partner feels emotionally starved despite having regular sexual intimacy. Neither person is wrong. They're just speaking different emotional languages. The avoidant is saying, "I love you," through physical presence and sexual connection. The partner is trying to hear, "I love you," through emotional conversation and verbal affirmation. What makes this particularly challenging is that avoidants often don't realize they're using sex as emotional communication. To them, it feels like the most natural and authentic way to express feelings that would be too uncomfortable or vulnerable to express through words. They might genuinely believe they're being emotionally intimate when they're being physically intimate, which creates confusion when partners complain about lack of emotional connection despite regular sexual connection. This difference in emotional language explains why sexual relationships with avoidants can feel simultaneously incredibly intimate and emotionally distant. The physical connection is real and meaningful, but it's carrying more emotional weight than it can actually bear for most people's relationship needs. It's like trying to have a complex conversation using only gestures. Some meaning gets transmitted, but not nearly enough for deep understanding or emotional satisfaction. Something else happens that reveals the difference between how avoidants handle these two types of connection. Their behavior after sex versus their behavior after emotional conversations shows completely different patterns. After sexual intimacy, many avoidants become more affectionate, more talkative, and more emotionally available temporarily. The physical release and connection seems to calm their nervous system and make emotional intimacy feel safer for a brief window of time. You might notice they're more likely to share personal information, ask about your feelings, or engage in emotional conversation immediately following sexual connection. It's like the physical intimacy creates temporary permission for emotional intimacy, but after emotional conversations or attempts at emotional intimacy, avoidants often become more distant, need more space, and seem emotionally depleted. Extended emotional vulnerability exhausts their system in a way that physical vulnerability doesn't. They might withdraw for hours or days after deep conversations, need time alone to recharge, or seem less affectionate until they've processed the emotional exposure they just experienced. This pattern confuses partners because it suggests that emotional intimacy is somehow more draining or threatening to avoidance than physical intimacy, even though most people would consider physical intimacy more vulnerable. The difference is that physical vulnerability is temporary and contained, while emotional vulnerability feels ongoing and unlimited. After sex, the vulnerability is over. After emotional intimacy, the vulnerability continues because the emotional information shared doesn't disappear. It becomes part of the relationship dynamic going forward. Think about it like the difference between lending someone your car for an afternoon versus giving someone a key to your house. Both involve sharing something important, but one has clear time boundaries, while the other creates ongoing access and responsibility. Let's address something that creates significant confusion in relationships with avoidants: their ability to be sexually adventurous or emotionally expressive during physical intimacy while being emotionally reserved in daily life. Many people involved with avoidance report being surprised by how open, communicative, and even emotionally expressive their avoidant partner can be during sexual encounters. They might share fantasies, express desires, talk about their feelings, or be verbally affectionate in ways they never are during regular conversation. This can create false hope that the avoidant is becoming more emotionally available, when actually they're just accessing emotional expression within the safe container of physical intimacy. Once the physical connection ends, they return to their usual emotional patterns. The sexual context creates temporary permission for emotional expression because it feels contained and specific to that moment, rather than representative of broader relationship dynamics. It's like how some people can only cry during movies. The emotional expression feels safe because it's tied to a specific temporary context. This pattern can be particularly confusing because it shows that avoidants are capable of emotional expression and vulnerability. They just can't access these states outside of very specific circumstances that feel safe to their nervous system. Partners often make the mistake of trying to extend this emotional openness into daily life, not realizing that the physical context was what made it possible in the first place. When they try to reference conversations or emotional expressions from intimate moments during regular daily interactions, avoidants often shut down or act like those conversations never happened. It's not that they're being dishonest or manipulative. They genuinely experience those moments as separate from their regular emotional operating system. It's like how some people can be completely different personalities when they're performing on stage versus how they are in private conversation. Now we need to talk about something that's particularly painful for partners of avoidance: how their sexual connection can remain strong even when emotional connection deteriorates. Many people report that their avoidant partner remained sexually interested and engaged even during periods when they were emotionally distant, critical, or seemingly checked out of the relationship. This creates confusion about the avoidant's true feelings and intentions. The sexual connection can persist because it operates independently of the emotional relationship dynamics. An avoidant can be frustrated with emotional demands, feeling suffocated by intimacy expectations, or even considering ending the relationship while still experiencing genuine sexual attraction and connection. This isn't compartmentalization in the way most people understand it. It's more like having two separate relationship systems running simultaneously. One system handles emotional connection and feels overwhelmed or threatened. Another system handles physical connection and feels safe and natural. These systems can operate completely independently, which means an avoidant can be sexually generous and present while being emotionally stingy and distant. They're not being manipulative. They're accessing the part of themselves that feels safe to share while protecting the part that feels vulnerable. Understanding this helps explain why sexual compatibility often outlasts emotional compatibility in relationships with avoidance. The physical connection doesn't require the ongoing emotional vulnerability that eventually overwhelms their system. It also explains why many avoidants suggest maintaining physical connection even when emotional connection is struggling. To them, the sexual relationship feels like the most genuine and sustainable part of their connection, so they can't understand why emotional problems would affect it. This creates another painful dynamic where partners feel like they're being reduced to physical connection only, while avoidants feel like they're offering their most authentic form of intimacy and can't understand why it isn't enough. There's something else that reveals the difference between how avoidants experience these two types of connection: their recovery time and emotional aftermath. After conflicts or emotional disconnection, avoidants often want to restore physical intimacy before addressing emotional issues. This isn't because they're trying to avoid problems. It's because physical reconnection feels safer and more natural to them than emotional repair work. They might initiate sexual connection as their way of apologizing, making up, or re-establishing closeness after arguments or distance. For them, this feels like genuine repair work because physical connection is where they access their feelings most naturally. But for partners who need emotional resolution first, this can feel like the avoidant is trying to smooth over problems with sex instead of actually addressing them. The timing feels wrong because they're operating from different assumptions about how repair and reconnection work. Avoidants often experience physical connection as emotional healing, while their partners experience it as avoidance of emotional healing. Neither perspective is wrong, but they're fundamentally incompatible approaches to relationship repair. This difference in repair strategies can create ongoing frustration where the avoidant feels like they're making genuine efforts to reconnect that aren't being appreciated, while the partner feels like real issues are being avoided through physical distraction. It's like one person trying to apologize through actions while the other person needs to hear actual words. Both are valid forms of apology, but they don't translate across communication styles. Let's talk about what happens when avoidants are with partners who understand and work with these different systems instead of expecting them to integrate in traditional ways. When partners can appreciate physical intimacy as genuine emotional expression without expecting it to translate into verbal emotional intimacy, something interesting happens. The pressure on both systems decreases, which often allows for more natural emotional connection. Avoidants tend to become more emotionally available when their physical intimacy is appreciated for what it is, rather than being seen as a substitute for emotional intimacy. When they don't feel pressured to be emotionally expressive in the same ways during daily life, they often become more willing to share emotional connection in smaller, more natural ways. This doesn't mean accepting emotional breadcrumbs or settling for only physical connection. It means understanding that for avoidants, physical intimacy is often their most genuine emotional offering, and appreciating it as such while still maintaining your own needs for other forms of connection. Some couples find ways to bridge these different systems by creating rituals or practices that honor both needs. Maybe emotional connection happens more naturally after physical connection. Maybe certain conversations happen more easily in physical proximity. Maybe emotional sharing feels safer when combined with other activities. The key is recognizing that avoidants aren't broken or withholding. They're operating from a different emotional framework that doesn't naturally integrate physical and emotional intimacy the way most people's systems do. Working with these differences instead of trying to change them often creates more authentic connection than trying to force integration that doesn't feel natural to either person's system. But there's something crucial we need to address about the limits of this understanding and when these patterns become problematic rather than just different. Understanding why avoidants separate physical and emotional intimacy doesn't mean accepting treatment that leaves your needs unmet. There's a difference between someone whose system works differently and someone who uses their attachment style to avoid emotional responsibility entirely. A healthy avoidant can engage emotionally when it truly matters, can communicate about relationship issues even if it feels uncomfortable, and can work toward creating more integration between physical and emotional connection over time. An unhealthy avoidant uses the separation between sex and intimacy to avoid all emotional accountability. You'll know you're dealing with healthy difference rather than dysfunction if the avoidant shows appreciation for your understanding, makes efforts to meet your emotional needs in their own way, and demonstrates growth in emotional availability over time, even if it's slow. But if you find yourself accepting emotional starvation because of great sexual connection, or if the avoidant becomes defensive and dismissive when you express needs for emotional intimacy, you're not dealing with attachment style differences. You're dealing with emotional unavailability that's being justified through attachment theory. Some people use their understanding of avoidant attachment to accept treatment that's genuinely harmful to their emotional well-being. Understanding someone's psychology doesn't mean their behavior is acceptable if it consistently prevents the relationship from meeting your basic human needs for emotional connection. The goal isn't to change an avoidant's natural approach to intimacy. It's to find someone whose natural approach is compatible with yours, or to work together toward creating a relationship that serves both people's authentic needs. Physical and emotional intimacy don't have to be completely integrated for a relationship to work, but both people need to feel genuinely seen, valued, and connected in ways that feel meaningful to them. There's also something important about how these patterns affect long-term relationship satisfaction that most people don't consider when they're focused on understanding and accommodating avoidant psychology. Over time, relationships that rely primarily on physical connection for emotional bonding often struggle with deeper compatibility issues. Physical intimacy can mask fundamental differences in emotional needs, communication styles, and life goals that become apparent only when emotional intimacy develops. When emotional intimacy remains underdeveloped, couples often discover they don't actually know each other very well outside of their physical connection. They might have strong chemistry but weak friendship, good sexual compatibility but poor communication, intense physical attraction but little emotional understanding. This can create relationships that feel passionate but unstable, connected but shallow, exciting but ultimately unsatisfying for both people involved. The avoidant might feel frustrated that their most genuine form of connection isn't appreciated, while the partner feels emotionally unknown despite physical closeness. Long-term relationship success usually requires some level of emotional intimacy development, even if it looks different from traditional models. Relationships built primarily on physical connection often struggle with major life decisions, conflict resolution, and maintaining connection during periods when physical intimacy isn't possible. This doesn't mean avoidants can't have successful long-term relationships. It means those relationships usually require finding ways to develop emotional connection that feel authentic and sustainable for their particular nervous system. Some avoidants do develop greater emotional intimacy capacity over time, especially when they're with partners who can appreciate their natural style while also gently encouraging growth. Others find partners whose needs align well with their natural offerings, creating relationships that work without requiring major changes. The key is honest assessment of whether a particular dynamic is sustainable and satisfying for both people long-term, rather than hoping that understanding will eventually transform incompatibility into compatibility. Understanding how avoidants handle intimacy versus sex gives you crucial insight into their internal world, but it should also help you make informed decisions about what you're willing and able to sustain in a relationship. If you recognize yourself in the avoidant patterns, this understanding can help you communicate your needs and limitations more clearly, rather than expecting partners to interpret your physical connection as sufficient emotional intimacy. If you're involved with an avoidant, this framework can help you decide whether their natural style of connection can meet your authentic needs, or whether you're trying to force compatibility that doesn't naturally exist. The goal isn't to judge either approach as right or wrong, but to understand how these different systems work, so you can make relationship choices that honor both people's genuine needs for connection and intimacy. Some people can bridge these differences and create deeply satisfying relationships that work with rather than against these natural patterns. Others discover that their needs are too fundamentally different to create sustainable satisfaction. Both outcomes are valid. Both require honest communication about authentic needs rather than trying to change or accommodate fundamental incompatibilities. When you understand that avoidants aren't choosing to separate physical and emotional intimacy to be difficult or withholding, but because their nervous system has learned that this separation feels safer, you can respond to their behavior with understanding rather than taking it personally. This understanding might help you work with their natural rhythm, or it might help you recognize that you need someone whose natural rhythm is more compatible with yours. Either way, you'll be making decisions based on accurate information about how their internal system actually works, rather than hoping that enough love or patience will eventually change their fundamental approach to intimacy and connection. Something I want to emphasize before we wrap up is that recognizing these patterns isn't about pathologizing avoidance or making excuses for behavior that hurts you. It's about understanding the psychological mechanics behind confusing relationship dynamics so you can make informed decisions about your own well-being. Many people use this information to stay longer in relationships that aren't meeting their needs, thinking that understanding equals compatibility. But understanding someone's psychology doesn't automatically make you compatible with their limitations. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is recognize that your needs and their capacity are mismatched, regardless of how much you care about each other. Other people use this knowledge to create more realistic expectations and find ways to connect that work for both partners. The key is honest assessment of whether the relationship can meet your authentic needs, not just your desire to make things work with someone you love. Remember that both physical and emotional intimacy are important human needs. Appreciating how someone naturally expresses connection shouldn't require you to abandon your own needs for different types of intimacy. The healthiest relationships happen when both people's natural styles can coexist without either person sacrificing essential parts of themselves. Have you noticed this difference between physical and emotional intimacy in your relationships with avoidant partners? Drop a comment about what patterns you've observed and how understanding this distinction has affected your perspective. If this helped clarify confusing avoidant behaviors, like this video and subscribe for more insights into attachment psychology and relationship dynamics. Thanks for watching.